We play and call it work.
Hey everybody, Matthew here from MiniWarGaming.com, and in this video I'm going to teach you how to play This Is Not a Test. This Is Not a Test is a skirmish post-apocalyptic war game created by Worlds End Publishing. It is super fun and pretty easy to learn, and I'm hoping by the end of this video you'll feel like, yeah, I could go and play that right now. Of course, you can go and purchase all of the PDF books, including the rule book and all of the supplements at worldsendpublishing.com. I'll make sure to put links in the description below to anything that I do reference in today's video. Also, if you want to see more gameplay, we have a narrative campaign that has started to go out for This Is Not a Test, featuring Dave and Josh. The first episode is free and the rest is in the Mini Wargaming Vault. Links, once again, will be in the description below. So without further ado, let's jump right in. In order to play This Is Not a Test, you need a few things. First, you need the rule book. You can get the PDF at worldsendpublishing.com at the link below. I got the PDF and then just printed it off at my local print shop. Sometimes the hardcover is available too, but they go through certain print runs, so you can check all that out below. You're also going to need some dice. Now, This Is Not a Test is a D10 system, which means you're going to need a few 10-sided dice. You don't really need more than 2 or 3. But it's always helpful to have a few extras. It also does use 6-sided dice sometimes, but honestly, if you only have one of those, you'll be fine. There's a variety of other gaming implements that you're going to need, some of them that you're probably familiar with. You're going to need a measuring tape, of course, to measure your distances. You're going to need some sort of templates to have for your grenades or for your flamer weapons. They actually have these in the main rule book that you can photocopy and then print off if you don't have access to your own templates. You're going to want some sort of beads or some sort of thing to mark models that have activated, or if their guns have jammed, or if they're currently panicked, or whatever it happens to be that you want to mark. There's also these fun bottle caps you can buy from Worlds End Publishing, which you can use for a variety of purposes, from objective markers to anything else. And of course, you're going to need miniatures and terrain, and a table to play it on. Now, pretty much all the miniatures that you see right here are from Worlds End Publishing. So they do have a rather large assortment of funky post-apocalyptic miniatures for use in This Is Not a Test. But as they even say in their own rule book, there are lots of places you could buy miniatures from, and you could use anything you really want to represent models in the post-apocalyptic future. I even thought once, hey, if I use some Star Wars models, it could just represent a bunch of animatronics that came to life from a nearby, some sort of wonderland or something like that. The terrain, of course, it can be from anywhere as well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put a list of links to different terrain manufacturers that I think are particularly good for post-apocalyptic games. So it won't be a comprehensive list, it'll just be a bunch that I would recommend for buildings like the ones that you see on this table, or the cars, or the fences, or other things like that. So you can check all that out below. But really, don't go too crazy about how much you have to have, but you do need to have enough terrain to block line of sight and allow for close combat to happen and not just everything to get shot off the table. But in the meantime, you could use things like books and soda cans and whatever you have on hand to represent your post-apocalyptic future. We're going to use this Peacekeeper warband as an example of what a typical warband may look like. There are 4 different kinds of models in a warband. There are leaders, elites, specialists, and rank and file. Your warband must include 1 leader, such as this one over here. It also can include up to 3 elites. These 2 models, for example, I'm including as outriders, which are elite models that can start further up the table and ignore some cover when they're firing. You can have 1 in every 3 models be a specialist, such as these 2 line breakers, which are really good at close combat, or this tactical, which is able to bring support weapons such as grenade launchers or light machine guns. And then you can have as many rank and file as you want, such as these officers in this canine. Now just remember, up to 3 elites, 1 in every 3 can be a specialist. So if you have 3 models, you can have 1 specialist. If you have 6 models, you can have 2. And in the case of this one that you see here, we have 9 models, so we can have 3 specialists. Before the game, you and your opponent agree on a points limit, usually described as a barter scrip purchase amount. In a campaign, you typically start at 400, but you could go higher if you want, as long as you both agree. When you go to purchase them, it'll tell you the barter scrip amount on the data card for the specific model that you're purchasing. And then you also have to spend the barter scrip on the weapons and equipment you decide to give them. You can also purchase relics for your warband, which are super rare items that are usually pretty powerful. Rank and file models cannot have relics. Also, no model can carry more than 2 relics at a time. You can't have the same relic more than once in the same warband, and you can't bring more than 3 relics to any game. Before you can play a game of This Is Not a Test, you need to choose a scenario. Now, in the main rulebook, there are 5 scenarios provided. There are other supplements that have come out that provide even more scenarios, so make sure you purchase those as well. There is a scenario table which you can roll on, or you and your opponent can just agree to choose one. You then roll for wasteland encounters. So you roll a d10 on a 1 or a 2, you roll on the hazards of the waste, on a 3 or 4, you roll on the creatures of the waste, and on a 5 to 10, there's no encounter, you just play the scenario as normal. If it's a hazard, it could be anything from a storm to some sort of fire. If it's creatures, then it might just be random creatures showing up on the table that you have to fight as well as your opponent, as well as doing whatever the scenario dictates. For today's tutorial, we're just going to choose the first scenario called Pest Control, where both players not only have to fight each other, but have to try to clear out some zombies or whatever creatures you want to put on the table and destroy their nests. The scenario will tell you how to set up the board and also how to deploy. Most scenarios have you deploying on opposite table edges up to 6 inches away from the table edge. Usually when you set up the board, you want to make sure that there's plenty of terrain so that any armies that have lots of close combat units will be able to get to ones who have more guns. In addition, there might be additional scenario rules for deploying things, such as zombie nests, or radiated zones, or whatever else it might dictate. As you pick and choose the models that will be in your warband, you need to understand what all the different statistics on their data card really mean. First off, we have their title, which is just their name, such as this Outrider. Their type, which is usually human, animal, plant, robot, or mutant. Their defense, which is what determines how easy it is to hurt them. Any armor you purchase usually augments this. How many wounds they have, which is typically 1, maybe 2. Later on when you upgrade, maybe 3. This is how many hits they can take before they're removed out of action. They have a move, which is how many inches they can move whenever they take a move action. They have their melee stat, which determines how well they hit in close combat. Their range stat, used for shooting. Their strength stat, which is used to determine if they injure somebody in close combat, and for various other strength tests. Probably the most important stat is your medal. The medal is for your activation test to see if you get 1 or 2 actions per turn. It also is a catch-all for things like how intelligent you are, how agile you are, how much you can survive, and what is your will like? Are you going to run away at the first sign of trouble? You also have access to certain skill sets. This is more used if you're playing a campaign, or if you're choosing an elite or leader, which allows you to start with certain skills. For example, the Outrider can have marksmanship, quickness, and survival as their skills. They can't choose from any other tree. It also tells you if they start with any special abilities. Like I said before with the Outrider, they start with the marksman and ranger skills. The ranger skill allows them to deploy anywhere on the table, more than 12 inches from enemies, as long as you can't be seen. And the marksman skill allows them to ignore light cover and turns heavy cover into light cover. And lastly, like we already talked about, there is this barter cost, which is how many barter script it costs to recruit this member to your warband. It does not come with any war gear though, so you must still purchase armor, equipment, weapons, whatever it is you want to give them. Normally you're going to play on a 4-foot by 4-foot table. Obviously, for the purposes of this tutorial, we're going to start things a little closer and just get straight to the action, because we don't want to bore you with 10-20 minutes of movement before we actually get to start shooting or fighting in close combat. We have followed the instructions of the scenario and set up a zombie nest. Now normally we set up more than 1 zombie nest, but we're just going to do 1 today. So this wonderful piece of terrain here from Printable Scenery that shows all this toxic sludge will be our zombie nest. It is where our zombies will spawn from. And then we've deployed our 2 warbands, which are smaller than usual, opposite each other. Today we're going to use a Peacekeeper warband on the one side, and their opponents will be Raiders. Obviously not really good at keeping the peace. In this scenario, before the game starts, we're also supposed to deploy 2 zombies next to each nest. So we're going to do that right now. I'm going to use some zombies from Age of Sigmar from Games Workshop. But honestly, you can use whatever you want. Heck, there's even a supplement that is put out for free by This Is Not a Test that allows you to print off some papers that you can then use for your zombie miniatures. Now that we're ready to play, it's time to roll for initiative. You roll for initiative every single turn, and there's typically 8 turns to a game. The scenario will tell you how many turns there are. To roll for initiative, each player rolls a d10. We're going to have black be the preservers and blue be the raiders. And when you're doing a roll-off, then you always re-roll if you get the same amount. And a 0 is a 10 on a d10 and is considered a critical success, and a 1 is a fumble. Now for initiative test, we're just seeing who's going to roll higher here. So the raiders have won the initiative roll-off and get to go first. This Is Not a Test has its own way of deciding when models get to activate. In some games, one warband would go, and then the other warband would go with their models. In other games, you would choose one model, and then your opponent would choose one model, and then you would choose one model, and your opponent would choose one model. That's called alternate activation. This Is Not a Test is kind of like alternate activation, except instead, whenever you want to activate a model, you take a metal test, an activation test. If you pass it, that model gets 2 actions, and you get to then activate another model. If you fail it, then you only get 1 action, and play passes to your opponent. The round is over once every model has been activated once. You cannot activate the same model more than once per round. Let's start by trying to activate this raider. It's just a regular rank and file and has a metal of 5. So the first thing I have to do is take an activation test. You do this by taking a d10, rolling it, and adding it to their metal of 5 for a total of 7. You need to get 10 or higher to pass. So if you have a metal of 5, you need to roll 5 or higher. Metal of 6 would be 4 or higher, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, this raider has failed his activation, which means he's only going to get 1 action before play passes to the opponent. If he had passed it, he'd get 2 actions, and then could actually then move on to another member of the raider warband. There are quite a few actions that you can choose from. You can move, you can stand, you can make a ranged attack, you can unjam weapons that have jammed up, you can make a close combat attack, you can concentrate so that your next attack is better. There might be certain abilities or certain things that you can do in a scenario, such as destroying the zombie nest. You can charge, you can climb, and you can switch weapons. Now I only have 1 action for this raider, and so he is going to charge. In order to charge, I have to do a move action followed by a free close combat action. You can't do more than 1 charge per turn, so I couldn't charge 1 zombie, kill it, and then charge another zombie. So we're going to look at his stat line, and we see that his move value is 5. So he can move up to 5 inches. So we're going to measure that right here and see, yes, he's well within 5 inches of that zombie. So we're going to move him into base contact because that is the range of his weapons. By default, the range of close combat weapons is base contact, when you're basically touching base to base. If it's longer than that, then it will specify in the description. Following that, I get to make a melee attack, a close combat attack. Now these are done by doing what's called an opposed stat test. First, we look at the raider's melee skill, which is 4. Next, we look at the zombie's melee stat, which is also 4. Both players would roll a d10, add their melee stat, and the attacker has to beat the defender. So if it's a tie, the tie goes to the defender. Now, thankfully, this raider has a little bit of a bonus. Because he's carrying 2 one-handed weapons, he's got a light weapon in one hand and a pistol in another, which counts as a one-handed light weapon. He gets +1 to his melee stat. So his 4 actually becomes a 5. So we take his d10, we add 5, and he gets a nice healthy 13. The zombie then rolls, and he can have the opposing player roll for this one, and rolls a critical success. And even if the critical success is not enough to win the roll-off, for example, if the raider had rolled a 9 or had a really, really high melee, the critical success always beats whatever else is rolled. If both players roll a critical success, then you actually re-roll. You don't then look at the numbers. You can never have 2 critical successes. So the zombie wins this fight. Now, because he's not the attacker, he doesn't injure the raider, but he could elect to push it back 1 inch. Now we play it so that creatures of the waste never actually elect to put things back 1 inch. So we're going to leave the raider in base contact with that zombie. Should the raider have succeeded in hitting the zombie, then we would go to the next step, which is to see if we could wound it. This is an opposed strength versus defense test. So once again, when we say opposed test, both players will roll a d10 and add their stats, and then the winner is the winner. If the strength one is the winner, it inflicts a wound on the defender. If the defender is the winner, then they don't get a wound taken off at all. So let's assume the raider did win that roll-off and hit the zombie. First off, he could choose to push the zombie back an inch. In this case, he doesn't want to. He wants to be in base contact with it and keep fighting it. So what we're going to do is a strength versus defense. So the strength of the raider is 5, as you can see on its data sheet. Now we also can impact it with its weapon. If we look at the melee weapons, he has a light weapon, which says it has a strength of strength plus 1. So we take the raider strength of 5 and it becomes 6. We're then going to compare that to the defense of the zombie, which is 7. So the raider is going to roll a d10 and add his strength of 6. Well, we got another critical. That's pretty awesome. The zombie is then going to roll a d10 and add its defense of 7. Now here's the interesting thing. So this is a 10, and then the strength, of course, being 6 brings us to 16. And 9 plus the defense of 7 would also be 16. So the ties would go to the defender, except we rolled another critical success, which means that wins regardless of what the opponent rolled, unless they also rolled a critical success, in which case both players would re-roll. So because the raider has won this roll-off, he inflicts 1 wound on the zombie. We look at the zombie sheet, we see that it only has 1 wound, which means it is going to be removed from play. It is a casualty. I'm going to put a little bead on our raider here to remind us that it has already activated. Now, because it failed his activation though, play passes back to the preservers. Because he has failed his activation, play passes back to the peacekeepers. The peacekeepers are going to try to activate this officer. We look at its data sheet and we see it has a medal of 5, which means we normally have to roll 5 or higher to get to 10. However, our leader right here has a skill called Motivator. Now, any leader could have this skill, but we're just saying that the raiders don't have it for the purpose of this tutorial. Now, Motivator allows any friendly models within 6 inches to get +1 to their activation test specifically, which means now our officer only has to get a 4 instead of a 5. We're gonna roll a 2. I'm going to flub it because this is a tutorial, and we're going to pretend that he passed. He rolled a 6. Normally that would have been a failed activation, and we'd only get 1 action, and play would pass back. But I want to show you another mechanic, and it's important that I pass in order for this to work. So our officer here, because he passed his activation test, now has 2 actions instead of just 1. Now he's armed with a simple rifle, and he wants to use it to try to take out one of the raiders. He's going to ignore that nearby zombie. So the first thing he's going to do is he's going to move for his first action. We're going to move him up to here so he has nice line of sight on those poor raiders. He is then going to take a shot with his rifle at, let's say, this regular raider right here. Now when we look at the statistics of a rifle, we can see its range. That is how far it can shoot. And we're definitely within that range here in this small little table. We also see things like its strength, its reliability, and any special rules it might have. Now we can see a rifle is a nice strength 7 with a reliability of 1. The reliability tells us how many jam tokens it would get if I fumbled this. A fumble, of course, being a 1 when I go to roll. So what do I need to roll in order to hit that raider? Well, unlike close combat, there is no opposed test here. I just have to get to 10. So we look at the range stat of this officer, which we can see right here to be 4. In order to get to 10, we would need to add 6 to that. But there are some modifiers. You can find these modifiers in a couple places in the book, one of them being at the very back as a quick reference. Now, the only modifier we're going to worry about here is the one that you see we're highlighting, which says that the officer has moved. Whenever you move, you get -1 to your shooting. So instead of needing a 6 to get to 10, now I need a 7 to hit that raider. So we're going to roll, and we roll a 7, which is a hit. Now, unfortunately, we don't know if it's going to wound that raider. We do not resolve range combat shots until somebody has failed an activation test. This is a really neat mechanic because it allows you to see that you don't really know exactly what's going on. There's a bit of a panic or just the hecticness of combat that stops you from knowing exactly if your shot was successful. So we're just going to put a little token on him. I happen to have these little skulls with numbers, and it has a number 7, so it reminds us that it's a strength 7 hit. But you can use whatever you want. You could put a little die next to him, you can put a bead and mark it down on a piece of paper. Typically, there's not going to be so many shots that you're going to forget what hit. Now, this model has finished activating because he's done his 2 actions. He did a move and then a shot. We'll resolve that strength 7 when somebody fails. Let's move on to the next one. We have our canine here. This canine has a medal of 5. And so once again, normally we'd have to roll a 5 to get to 10, but because we have a motivator within 6 inches, we only have to roll a 4. So let's roll, and he fumbles it. Now, a fumble on an activation doesn't usually mean much unless you're carrying a non-weapon relic, in which case it actually malfunctions, or you happen to be a robot, like our freelancer friend over here on the Raider side, in which case they actually shut down. But because this K9 neither is a robot, nor has any relics, the 1 just means that he automatically failed his metal test. He'll still get 1 action, and so we're going to use it to charge this zombie. We've already seen this before, so we'll just kind of go through this a little faster. We're going to do a close combat attack, which is an opposed melee check. Now, the K9 has a melee of 6, and we of course know the zombie has a melee of only 4. So the K9 will roll a d10 plus 6. Ooh, we got a healthy 15 with that 9. And then the zombie will roll, and he'll need to roll a critical to stop that. He fails. We look back once again at strength versus defense. Unlike the range attacks, we resolve close combat attacks right away because they're much more definitive. The strength of the K9 is 6, but he's equipped with natural weapons, which if we go and look over at the weapons table, we see that natural weapons give you a +1 strength. So he is strength 7, which means we're going to be doing a strength 7 versus defense 7 opposed test. So we'll do the K9 first. He rolls a 7 and gets +2 to it and gets a 9 in total. That's not very good because remember, ties go to the defender, which means the zombie only needs to roll a 2 or higher in order to stay alive. I actually rolled a 1, didn't fudge that, I'll tell you when I fudge it, and the zombie fails and he dies. And we remove him from play, which is great for the scenario because they get money for every zombie they kill. It's also good for experience if you're playing in campaigns. Now this dog has finished activating and it failed its activation, which means now we actually resolve the strength 7 hit from the rifle. If somebody else had gone with a gun, they could choose, do I keep firing at this raider to make sure he dies? Or do I fire somewhere else and spread out the shots? That's your tactical choices that you have to decide. So once again, we're doing an opposed roll, the strength of the weapon versus defense of the target. Now in this case, the raider is wearing scrap armor. If we look at the armor table, we can see that all armor gives defense bonuses in melee and against ranged. Now scrap armor is not that great, so it only gives a +1 defense bonus in melee and doesn't give anything to ranged. So when we go back and look at the raider's stats, and we see it has a defense of 6, we're going to be doing a strength 7 hit versus defense 6. So once again, blue will be the preservers, strength 7 hit, and he gets a healthy 15. And then the red will be the raider with his defense of 6, and he gets 15 as well. And that works out nicely because then it allows us to show what a grazed test is. And so right here, we see the roll off. This weapon did not manage to injure the raider. However, if you hit somebody and do not injure them, then that model has to take a grazed test. This is a type of morale that decides if they're going to run and duck for cover. It's once again another metal test where you have to get to 10. Most things will call for intelligence tests or agility tests or survival tests, and they'll tell you the difficulty, the target number, the TN, as you'll see. In the case of most things, it'll be 10, but others might be 11 or 12 or who knows what else. It just depends on whatever it says. But a good rule of thumb is it usually needs a 10. We look at the raider and he's got a medal of 5. And so he's going to have to roll 5 or higher in order to get to 10. So if we roll it, we roll a critical success, which means he automatically passes it. Now you can always choose to fail a graze test because you might actually want to run and duck into cover, especially if you see there are more guns coming. If he had failed, he would move 3 inches towards the nearest cover, which is about right here, and then he would have to fall prone. Remember, when you're prone, you're a little harder to hit from a distance, you're easier to hit in close combat, and it takes 1 action to stand up. But he passed, so we're not going to worry about that. Although we've already demonstrated close combat, I want to go into a few more details of how it works. We already know that if you're in base contact, you can fight in close combat. What I didn't tell you that is if you are in base contact, there are certain things that you cannot do. You cannot fire weapons, and you can also not move freely without disengaging. To disengage, you first have to do an agility test, which is a metal test difficulty 10. So you roll a d10 and add your metal. If you get 10 or more, then you can move away. Or a strength test will do the same thing. Now, there are some other modifiers to combat when you are fighting. We can look right here on page 26 of the This Is Not a Test rulebook, and we can see those modifiers. There are a few of them. The first one is the enemy prone. You get +2 to hit them, obviously a little easier. Also, just like with range combat, you can concentrate to hit better. So let's say you are already in base contact with an enemy, and you pass your activation test, and you have 2 actions. You could use the first action to get +2 to the next swing that you do, which would be immediately followed up by you making a close combat attack with your second action. Also, Both of these models would get +1 to their melee for having two one-handed melee weapons. Shields count as that, and pistols count as that, as well as obviously the light weapons they are both wielding. Also, if you have help, for each additional friendly model in base contact with the enemy, you get +1 to your melee. Lastly, if you are attacking an enemy behind cover, you will get -1 to your melee stat. Also, just like we mentioned before, if you win combat but don't take out your opponent, either because they have multiple wounds, you fail to wound, or you are the defender, you can push them back an inch. Or in the case of cover, you could actually choose to cross the cover so that you'll no longer have that -1 penalty. So like before, when they were in base contact with each other, if the raider won combat, he could push back the other model an inch. Or he can keep him there. It's his choice. If he were to be attacking the raider and fails to wound him, but already knows he's not going to wound him, he could then choose to push him back. Maybe because he wants to move somewhere else, or because he wants somebody else to shoot freely at them. Which brings us to the last point. You don't really want to shoot at people in combat, because if you do, it actually just randomizes who you hit. So anybody firing into this combat would have a 50-50 chance to hit the target that they want. So unless you don't really care who you're hitting, don't fire into combat. We have covered the basics of ranged combat. Let's talk about a few more modifiers and other things to think about. First off, we assumed that we had line of sight when we made our shots before. Everybody was out in the open, so it was pretty obvious. But it's not always obvious if you have line of sight. In order for a model to be able to see another model, you literally have to be able to see it, as if from their perspective. Sometimes you have to bend down and actually look from their point of view to see if this is the case. And sometimes it's hard to tell, so you and your opponent just have to agree and be nice about it. Also, once you go to attack, there are some other modifiers. Now, we've already talked about concentrating with the close combat. You spend your first action to concentrate, then you can use your second action to fire and get +2 to the shot. This is especially useful for things like sniper rifles or other one-shot weapons. You can also elect to do something called suppressive fire. This gives you a +3 to hit. It cannot be combined with concentrating, so you can't get up to +5. And it will not do damage unless you roll a critical hit. And the idea of suppressive fire is it allows you to hit a unit more easily, and then that model will have to do a graze test and hopefully drop down and get out of the way. Now, there are some other modifiers. If you've moved, -1 to hit. If the opponent has moved twice this turn, it's -1 to hit them because they're going so quickly. And then there is cover. Now we have two types of cover, light and heavy cover. For example, this fence would probably provide light cover to the models behind it. So if the attacker is shooting at these models, and when you look down from his point of view, if this fence covers them even partially, then they have light cover and is -1 to hit them. Heavy cover, such as this car, does the same thing except provides a -2 bonus. It's best to decide before the game starts with your opponent what counts as heavy cover and what counts as light cover. Some things are very obvious. Big solid objects like cars would be heavy cover, and light fences would just be light cover, but there might be some things that you're not sure of. Just agree before you play the game. Lastly, if you are firing at a model who is prone and you are more than 6 inches away, they are hard to hit and are -1 to the penalty, to your ranged attack. If they are prone and behind cover, even if you can see part of the model, they actually don't count as being in line of sight. This is because of the way models are done. It is impossible sometimes for them to lie down in such a way that you can't actually see them. So you have to just pretend that they've managed to get their profile all the way to the ground. Finally, there's always a chance that ranged combat will not go well for you and that your weapon will jam. If you ever roll a fumble, which remember is a natural 1 on a d10, regardless of your modifiers, not only do you miss, but your weapon jams. Now, every weapon has a reliability. You look at this chart right here and you can see these ranged weapons usually have a reliability of 1 or 2. The higher the reliability, the worse it is, because it determines how many jam tokens that you put right next to the model. So for example, this rifle, let's pretend it's an assault rifle, has a reliability of 2. So we'd put 2 jam tokens next to him. That means that rifle cannot be fired again until those jam tokens are cleared. It costs 1 action to clear 1 jam. So you can see that it's a big inconvenience to have your weapon jam in the middle of the game. There are many situations which might make a fighter not want to stay in the game any longer and want to run for his table edge. These are called morale tests. And we've already talked a little bit about will tests when we talked about being grazed from a shot, but morale tests will determine if you run it off the table, either towards your table edge or off completely. To make a morale test, you make a will test with difficulty 10 or a metal test with difficulty 10. And if you pass, you're fine. And if you fail, you immediately make a move towards your table edge, trying your best to end in cover. For example, if this officer had to make a morale test, I'd roll a die and add it to his medal. If his medal is 5 and I rolled a 6 and I got an 11, and he would pass. If I had failed it by rolling a 4 or lower, then he would move back into cover, and the next turn he'd be able to operate just fine. However, if you ever fumble a morale test, then you're actually just removed from the table as you flee in absolute terror and panic. This does not apply to graze tests and other will tests, by the way, only to morale tests. Now the question is, when do you take morale tests? Well, as we can see on page 27 of This Is Not a Test, you have to take a morale test when you are wounded in melee but not put out of action. For example, if you have more than one wound, but somebody hurts you in close combat, there's a chance that you're going to want to run away. If your leader goes out of action and is within 12 inches and line of sight of those models, then those models have to take a morale test. If your warband is reduced to 50% or less of its size for the first time, then it must make a morale test. So for example, these 4 peacekeepers, let's say 2 of them were removed, then immediately this leader and the dog would have to take a morale test. And if they fail, they would run towards their table edge. If they rolled a 1 and fumbled, they are removed from the game. You then have to take another morale test on every model once your warband is reduced to 25% of its original size. In the case of this warband, it would be once 3 models were lost. And there might be other special abilities or situations that call for morale tests. And just a reminder for everybody out there that this campaign, half of it is in the MiniWarGaming Vault, but you can get the whole thing for free if you go to miniwargaming.com/test and sign up for a free 7-day trial right there. And if you do it there, and you cancel later on, you can still have this whole campaign for free. It's our like a little ethical bribe to get you to try it out. So miniwargaming.com/test. That brings us to the end of our demonstration of how to play This Is Not a Test. There is much more to the game. There's all the skills and mutations, upgrades for your robots. There's the whole campaign system that is super fun to play. But the scope of this video was just to teach you the basics of how to play a regular game of This Is Not a Test. I hope that you'll try it out. You can go and purchase the PDF rules at World's End Publishing. All the links will be below. And make sure you can check that out there. And then you can buy the supplements if you like it. Use whatever miniatures and terrain you happen to have. Or throw a few more bucks to World's End Publishing and buy a lot of their miniatures, because we want to support indie developers wherever we can. And as I said at the beginning, we do have a This Is Not a Test narrative campaign going on right now for Vault members. The first episode is available for free on YouTube. You can check that out in the description below. And then we're hoping that you'll become a Vault member and support us so that you can watch the rest of that narrative campaign and the other thousands of videos that happen to be in there as well. A big thank you goes to Joseph McGuire for creating this game, who is the creator of World's End Publishing and This Is Not a Test. It is a fantastic game and we love it, and we hope to see more from it. I hope that you enjoyed this. Stay tuned for more how to play videos, This Is Not a Test battle reports, and all sorts of other stuff. Thanks for watching. Happy working.